Hi, I am Jeffrey Wernick, and like to make just a couple of brief opening statements. Uh, upon doing some due diligence, I've read that basically this podcast has gotten very good commentary and reviews, um, and never really thought much about really. We came up with a name. I think it was Bruce's suggestion, the name that is stuck, but we really never really like thought about how do we brand this podcast. So in the last short while, we've been talking about should we really put effort into branding? We came up with the decision to do so. So, starting from today, Fine Points will now be known as the Fine Print. And the tagline to go with that is the truth is in the fine print.
Yeah.
So, obviously a play on words because the truth is usually in the fine print, like the devil in the details,
Mhm.
and Bruce is excellent at finding the devil in the details. So I think this is very, very appropriate. I also like to, in order, say some self-serving words about, this, the fine print is, I think we're a unique podcast. What makes us unique? Because basically our reference point to everything going on today is to benchmark it against our foundational roots. I mean, there are other podcasts I think that do a very good job of talking about the law and the courts and things like that, and some recent precedent, and most of those are people who generally have some sort of, even though I think the legal works in other podcasts is quite good, but most of the people have some sort of partisan bias. So even though I think they try and do a pretty good job of being neutral in a lot of the cases, but ultimately when you listen to them a lot, and I do, you can detect a partisan bias. I think the unique thing about us is we always benchmark everything to our foundational roots, and we benchmark everything for the purpose that an American Revolution was fought, was to advance liberty. Okay, and the liberty should always be the benchmark: the preservation, the conservation of liberty and justice. So that's always our benchmark, and I think we're unique amongst people who doing podcasts to focus on this thing. So I think it's appropriate that we really have a brand. We will be opening up channels under the name. The fine print, we'll be opening it up. I think it's already been opened up on BitChute. So if you look on BitChute and you see PodShoot underneath that, it says the fine print. So this will now be under the fine print. I think we created or will create X Twitter account under the fine print and other platforms. So I think over the next week or 2 weeks, a team will be opening up on the various platforms a specific um, fine print account, fine print channel. Of course, the content will still be able to be found on BitChute's channels as well, but our main focus will be to advance, the brand and of this podcast. So I'd like to say welcome to the fine print. So, that being said, I want to just read a couple of quotes to begin with, because Bruce makes the point, and this is something that Ryan and I share, but this is a point that Bruce emphasizes every week, that ultimately for us to preserve ourselves as a constitutional republic requires an informed, knowledgeable citizenry. Okay. So that's a prerequisite. Okay. It's a necessary, maybe not sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition for preserving a constitutional republic. So, and other people, some who were around part of the founding generation. So I've chosen four quotes here from by four different people, and I'm going to read the quotes quickly, and then I'm going to ask Bruce to tell people who the significance of each one of the authors of this brief quote is. So the first, and I'll go through all four quotes first, and then Bruce, you can give a little background on who each of these people were. Freedom can exist only in the society of knowledge. Without learning, men are incapable of knowing their rights. That was written by Benjamin Rush. The next quote: the ignorance of the people is the footstool of despotism. That was written by St. George Tucker. Um, and then the third one: reason and ignorance, the opposites of each other, influence the great bulk of mankind. Reason obeys itself, and ignorance submits to whatever is dictated to it. And that was written by Thomas Paine. Uh, a final quote is: it is in the interest of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice. And that's Samuel Adams. So, but I'm going to say one more comment before Bruce can describe the significance of each one of those people. We know that most of the propaganda from both parties, okay, Democrats and Republican, we know most of what they spread is bullshit, okay? Since most of what they spread is bullshit and they amplify and circulate bullshit, okay, 24/7, that's then amplified through the media, okay? People who know they're circulating bullshit are promoting ignorance, okay? So the reality is this is the challenge for every citizen is you turn on the TV and what you watch is either Democrats or Republicans who get invited onto Fox or CNN or or MSNBC, which I guess is now MS Now or something like that, or Newsmax or some other program like that. They're there for a purpose. They're there to spread bullshit to their audience. There's very little education. No, people don't watch those shows learning anything. Okay, they don't learn anything of substance, and there's almost no conversation relating things back to our foundational roots. As we're approaching the year, that's supposed to be a celebration about our foundational roots. That's unique about what we do here in the fine print. And that's what I think is important about our house, is because we try and have people knowledgeable. We want to spread knowledge. We don't want to spread bullshit. People can agree or disagree with our assessment, but we're not attempting to bullshit anybody. We're not attempting to support a specific candidate or advance the interests of a specific party. What we're trying to do is advance the ideas and ideals of our foundational generation, of the roots of this country. So that being said, Bruce, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, Benjamin Rush, St. George Tucker, Thomas Paine, of course, was the voice of the American Revolution. He wrote Common Sense. I think George Washington said, he was worth many, many battalions with his rhetoric. He actually was not an American. He was Great Britain. He'd immigrated to the United States after he helped the Americans win their revolution. He went to France. He was a little starry-eyed and ended up in prison in France because he wasn't going to bow to the likes of Robespierre during the Reign of Terror. But the important thing, I believe, to remember is that these voices that are captured in those quotes were not unique at all. They were generally universally shared. I mean, like Madison, knowledge will forever govern ignorance. Thomas Jefferson, a nation that hopes to be free and ignorant in a state of civilization hopes what never was and never can be. So this amongst the thinkers was universally shared. And in fact, George Washington's very first State of the Union message said, we really have to invest in education because without an educated public, we cannot survive. That the educated public is the one that creates the intellectual imprint of what the government does. And we can never do enough, to provide more and more information, critical thinking, and compare that understanding today. And again, I want to repeat, Ryan and Jeffrey, education to them was not STEM. It was learning about why do we exist? What is liberty? What is justice? How do we treat people fairly? What is going to be the best instruments to enable everyone to have a fair chance to develop their faculties and pursue their ambitions? That's what they were thinking about. Wisdom to them was philosophy. Wisdom to them and knowledge or education was not a trade school where you could make money. it was an education that enables you to be a citizen and make sure that our procedures, that our mechanisms for allocating power remained untarnished and in equilibrium. And that's what's so different today. I understand you can be very, very gifted in mathematics, and you can make planes go very, very fast, but that doesn't increase at least the benchmark of civilization that you were talking about that was understood by the framers, which was to the extent that the United States succeeds, it's to the extent that it gives everybody, irrespective of their background, their birthplace, or anything else, an opportunity to succeed based on two things alone. One, their ambition and industry and discipline, and two, their character. That's all it counts. Other than that, that is success. Success is not going to Mars. Success is not dominating the planet and invading Venezuela or Iraq or Afghanistan or anything like that. Venezuela is not killing, your enemies. Success is giving everyone the dignity to pursue their ambitions in a fair, level playing field as best as we can. And we applaud everybody to the extent that they have been able to develop their faculties. And Jeffrey and Ryan, this was the first time, and perhaps the only time in the history of the world, that this conception of a nation was embraced by the majority. Even today, you have such absurdities as kings and queens, in Great Britain, whatever. They have Shakespeare, but they didn't have any real deep philosophical thinkers who understood like our framers did. That was the greatness. Now, of course, it was an ideal. It was an aspiration at the time. We've moved on in many respects. We've lifted, the fetters that hampered, minorities, blacks, Catholics at one time, women, from moving forward. But it was still the aspiration that everyone agreed upon. And when we fell short of the aspiration, we understood we were falling short. We didn't try to cover up and conceal and make it believe that we were the God's chosen people. Remember Thomas Jefferson, who still had slaves. He said, "I tremble for my country when I remember that God is just and his justice not going to sleep forever." They struggled with that. And we actually had to fight a civil war. But it wasn't a civil war that was only fought over slavery. But it was one joined by a huge portion of the North. Some didn't fight for that reason alone, but ultimately the war turned into that emancipation of a good portion of our citizens. But those are the things that made the United States unique. The concept of why we exist as a country, unique still, in my judgment, in the whole world today. Even with Donald Trump and his anti-immigrant status, immigrants still come to the United States. Not for Trump, it's because we still have these ideals that excite everybody who has any entrepreneurship, who wants to succeed based upon their own merit. And that's the human capital that would enable us, in my judgment, to soar to the heights if we actually had those ideals still governing, the United States of America, which would mean, among other things, a quite shrunken government, because we wouldn't have the $1.5 trillion for the national defense. We wouldn't have all these other encumbrances that detract from liberty and opportunity. But that's, I cannot repeat enough. This is unique in the annals of human history, that the governors set these standards as to why we exist. Every other country, we exist to promote kings, queens, dominate, control, and whatever. Scipio, Africanus, Hannibal, fighting. Why? Julius Caesar, Napoleon. That's what makes us unique, and we can regain it. All we need is the citizens to understand that and embrace it. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's there for us.
Well said, Bruce. If I had two small points to what both of you said, one just back on your point, Bruce. It's interesting. The one of the many amazing things you just said that stood out to me was the difference of thinking at that point, and many different points. But what you were highlighting is not memorizing the way we're supposed to think of things, but being critical thinkers, yes. Looking at the information and being able to come, like you said, philosophy, like that's what is largely absent, like you point out so often, is that lack of critical thinking. And to one opening point to what you said, Jeffrey, which I really appreciate as well, is, people may look at what we talk about today and see us criticizing Trump, for example, and take that only as a partisan thing. But which hopefully this podcast will continue for a while, stay tuned and watch as the next administration comes along, and the critical principled stances we take will be the same depending on what their actions are. I just think people tend to tunnel vision, kind of see what we're focusing on today, and it's really just whoever is currently violating those things. But what a great starting point today. I really, Bruce, you really opened well, so thank you for that.
There's been a couple, periodically there's some comments, because I always try and diligently read the comments to each episode, and I read them not necessarily because I'm concerned about what people say, but I might want to respond to people, not to argue with them, but I if people submit comments, I'd like people to know that their comments that they're submitting are being read. So so because I want to keep encouraging people to comment. So I think the best way to encourage people to comment is respond to their comments, not ignore them. And I think that's probably unique, because I think a lot of the people really don't read the comments that are submitted to them. They let people comment, and they let people comment amongst themselves, but they probably don't pay attention to it. But I pay attention to them, because when people ask questions or have some doubts or things like that, I want to let them know that their voices are heard, and that they're responded to. And yes, I think people forget right now, and I'm going to reiterate this: the Democrats are irrelevant now. Okay, they don't control anything. If anything, what we see from this recent shutdown is a reinforcement that the Democrats are irrelevant. The Republicans are they're so irrelevant that the Republicans are not even negotiating with them, right? That's what happened. And, Democrats kept saying, nobody, here's this image. We're here in the House. We're here in the Senate. Nobody's around here. Nobody's us for us to talk to. We want to negotiate. Nobody's negotiating with us, So finally, the Democrats submitted their surrender, their document to surrender. And of course, the Republicans, were generous enough to accept their surrender. Okay. So, there's no point. And Ryan's right. I mean, the history of us personally, okay, is, first, Ryan and I don't even really believe in government. So we don't support any party because we don't even believe in government. Okay. so we're never going to support any party. And if you asked, all three of us, we would have been impeaching Bill Clinton. We would have been impeaching George Bush. Both Bushes we would have been impeaching. We would have been impeaching Obama. We would have been impeaching Biden, and we'd be impeaching Trump. So we're equal opportunity impeachers, because our reference is not partisan. Our reference is with respect to the founding documents, and we're going to hold everyone to that standard. Okay. So yes, if the Democrats get control over one of the branches of government, in 2026, and they start abusing it the same way Republicans do, but a little different, but the same, we'll be calling them out, and we'll be calling them, pretty much the same type of description of what we're describing the Republicans now that control, all the branches. So there's no point in talking about what's irrelevant. We want to talk about what's currently relevant. And so what's currently relevant, is basically Trump and a party that follows fairly lockstep in him, even though that might be beginning to change. And if it does change, we'll address that as well. So I want people just to understand is, we're indifferent whether they're whatever name they put themselves on, whatever label they put themselves on. We only have one frame of reference: how they relate back to our founding documents, how what they do advances liberty, how what they do advances freedom, how what they do advances justice, how what they do advances a peaceful world, okay? An America that's not an empire, okay? An America that lives within its own boundaries, okay? And doesn't interfere in the world in a way the Constitution never contemplated we would do. And that should be self-evident. Why should it be self-evident? Okay, everyone said in the document, no standing armies. If we wanted to be an empire, you would think they'd say, let's have a big, huge army. Let's tax the people. Let's issue a lot of debt. Let's have an army, and let's have it be all the time. And let's put troops all over the world. Okay. But what they said is guarantee for tyranny is a standing army. Okay. Guarantee for the enemy of freedom and liberty is a standing army. Okay. So all the people that like this huge standing army and troops all over the world, and all the interventions that we do with supposedly all these existential threats, where this boat of a few people came off, and if it landed in the United States, we don't even have evidence that their destination was the United States. Okay, we don't even have that evidence. Nothing has been shown to us on that these are drug dealers, that they were carrying huge quantities of drugs, and that they were going to come directly to the United States. And if we knew exactly what their destination was, why don't we let the boats come, have a full police force waiting to arrest them, so they get off. We confiscate all the. That's rule of law. Rule of law is that we wait for the drugs to come. Okay, then we have probable cause because we have some intelligence out there that these are people carrying drugs. That are each boatload is going to kill 100,000 people. So or maybe more, which is the type of allegations that they're making. And then we'd wait. If we supposedly know exactly where they're going, okay, we can be able to await them, arrest them, and then when we arrest them, maybe they can tell us who the bosses are, and we can go after the bosses. On that. That seems to be a more intelligent policy, and that's a policy nobody would say is bad. We take them to trial, or they say, yeah, you're right. You showed us all the evidence that you have against us. You're right. We got to plead guilty. And then we'll say, okay, now that you've admitted that, we'll reduce your sentence. Tell us about who the other bosses are. Tell us about all your think about all the knowledge we could get. Because once they get to the shore, then we could learn all about their distribution networks. Why don't we want to know that? If they're bringing drugs here, we know they're bringing drugs, and we know exactly where they're going. Okay, because we could track them as they're going. We could have our drones follow them all along the path. And when they come here, we're there waiting for them with open arms. We'll put the cuffs on them, and we'll sit them down and say, who are we going to deliver these to? Who are your distribution channels? Wouldn't we want to know that? Okay, so that's why this doesn't make any sense at all. Okay,
yeah.
Doesn't make any sense at all.
But let me add a couple of points here. Jeffrey, one with regard to the nonpartisan. I think before Ryan joined us, certainly when I began, this was before Trump administration, I was criticizing Biden every single day, including the pardon of Hunter Biden is utterly ridiculous. Weapons everywhere, Ukraine, again, doing the empire, maybe the empire light. And as me personally, at age 25, at the Justice Department, I was involved in having Richard Nixon impeached. And then I led the charge against Bill Clinton impeached. And I wrote articles of impeachment against Bush and Cheney and Obama, all these illegal wars, illegal surveillance. That's what we haven't even discussed or touched upon. We talk about liberty and justice. We have a surveillance state. Everything is intercepted. And we don't even know where it goes. The National Security Agency. And that's contrary to the Fourth Amendment, which was really the trigger, if you will, of the American Revolution. But I just want to underscore that we want critical thinking. We don't want to speak and then you just accept what's on the program as being gospel. If you think it's wrong, you should have reasons. Raise it. No one's infallible. That's what made Socrates so wise and unique. He didn't believe the oracle at Delphi saying you're the wisest man in all of Athens. He said, well, maybe I am. I know what I don't know. And that's critical. And the other point that I want to underscore is we are the only program, I believe, that really goes back to these foundational principles, what Jeffrey called the benchmarks. You don't get it in civics anymore. You don't get it in school anymore. They don't teach this stuff anymore. Standards of learning or whatever, they're all written in empire bubble. And to be we're really unique. We're the teachers in the classroom of the country, because this doesn't even exist. Not only elementary, secondary, colleges, universities, they don't teach any of this stuff. Zero. It's like the American Revolution never existed. And July 4th is just a holiday so we can get to buy Chinese firecrackers, and have fun. Rather than understanding, again, the reverence we ought to have for those 56 signatories who signed their death warrants on July 4th, 1776, to secure these rights to liberty, inherent, unalienable rights to liberty, to justice, to freedom, and to an allocation of power that was rested on the consent of the governed. They risked their lives. Who on July 4th, 1776 stands up and says, I'm willing to do that myself, if needed, in order to ensure our posterity inherits the freedoms we have? That's how unique I believe this is. But you got to start someplace. And we always remember the saying, if not us, who? If not now, when? It may take a long time before we get the pendulum reversed, but out of reverence and gratitude to the framers of the Constitution and the signers of the Declaration, that's what we have to do. A sense of decency of why we exist as people in the United States. We're different than living in other countries because this country is unique.
Well said, Bruce. Bravo. Brian?
Well, my thoughts are going to what you had touched on. If you want to get into the Venezuela point, I have some things to add to that. Just it's interesting that obviously agree with what you were laying out there. It's just what strikes me as you're saying that is the thought that not even just critically thinking, a person that's intelligent enough to look at the basic standing of the situation beforehand and now what's happening knows what they're doing. Nobody really buys these narratives. There's people that just want to sell, want to take a side. That's how I take it. I just think it's so self-evident. But what's interesting to add to it is that there has been a few nuances to it. One, I think it was maybe a week ago or more, there was a boat that they actually seized. And they made a big deal about it. They had the people jumping on board. They arrested. They found all this cocaine. And I'm thinking, okay, well, if everyone before it, they were bombing, and then it went right back to bombing them right after that, then what was the difference here? I think it's because they actually knew that there was a lot of cocaine. And this is my opinion, wanted to make a point to say, look at all the drugs. But whether that's the case or not, it shows the anomaly of it all. Why wouldn't they do that every other time? Like Jeffrey clearly pointed out, why not arrest them and prove this? Why not find their distribution, make it go even further? There's clearly more to that story, but it's all obviously illegal in all of it. But also just the way that they're taking this down, the way that that there was fishermen that were taken, there's fishermen that were rather killed, and they know this, they can prove it. It really broadens out the story. And I'm curious what you guys think about what the real objective is, because for one don't think about drugs.
This is just Hollywood. I just think number one. I don't favor drug use. I've never touched drugs in my whole life, not even a puff of marijuana. I don't care about it. But if other people want to do it, that's one thing. This is the stupidity, if you will, and maybe despite any good intentions, which I don't attribute to the administration anyway, of prohibition. Why are you trying to do this? The fact is that we've been at a war since 1971 when Nixon announced war against drugs, $1 trillion. It has done nothing to dent the addiction issue. It done nothing other than create criminals,
and grown it,
and corruption. Right? That's all that has happened. Now, I don't applaud people who use that, but you got to use your brain. When the cure is worse than the disease, then you know what? You let the disease kind of fester there. It's a disease, and try to take care of it. All the war against drugs, if you will, has just created a staggering encroachment on individual rights and liberty. The Fourth Amendment issues, the spying issues, and whatever. The fact is that these transactions are virtually all consensual. If people buy the drugs, I don't applaud that. I would favor education, saying you're destroying yourself, but there's only so much you can do. And all that happens with this staggering law enforcement is, one, you reward the people who are even more criminal because they're willing to take the risk to violate the law. They enhance the price because the risk is higher. You don't do anything to dent the actual usage, which after 50 some years is exactly the same as it was, maybe even worse than it was in 1971. And what have you accomplished? Nothing. At least if you just, and even if it were true that you made it illegal because you want to send a message, we don't like it, but you really don't have any serious enforcement. At least we don't have these civil liberties violations, all these interceptions, all these Fourth Amendment issues in order to stifle the drug trade. These issues of the Fourth Amendment, they arose during Prohibition. That's when the wiretapping began. Really? So that you can't have wine in communion or something? It's ridiculous in my mind. And that's why, again, if we got back to the benchmark principles, listen, we don't necessarily agree with this, but if you want to ruin your own life, there's only so much that we can do. We disapplaud it, but it's not the stuff of criminal law enforcement. You can try to treat them or something of that force, but the criminal justice system ends up being worse than the disease. I think that's been shown everywhere. Now, I'm not going to say you legalize it, it's going to be great. When you amended the Prohibition Amendment, did it make everyone teetotalers? No, but at least it made it less bad. And that's why we haven't tried to resurrect the Prohibition Amendment. And I say that goes again to this idea that the only times that you try to encroach upon liberty and justice is when there's imminent danger that you will destroy somebody involuntarily, their physical or mental health. And that standard has not been met with regard to cocaine or fentanyl or whatever. It isn't there. I'm in favor of education and discouragement. You can ostracize people who use it, but what's happening now is an example of way government overreach that's coming back to destroy ourselves. Another point I'd make is, why the heck are we even, if Venezuela is Venezuela, and remember what they're doing here, let us assume that Venezuela, in some sense, with cartels, they get some money off of the drugs. Say that Maduro is involved in some of these drug stuff. We have to remember, Western civilization went to war twice against China. Opium wars. You know what they were over? We wanted to sell and make all the Chinese opium addicts, right? And we went to war, said, "Wait, you're preventing us from selling opium to you." That's the West. Wanted to have that opportunity to make money off of selling opium. So this is not, some kind of a novelty aberration out of Western civilization. That's what we did when we thought we could make money out of it. Anyway, it puts it in perspective that this is not something so beyond the pale that we'd have to oppose. So if Venezuela wants to sit there, and as Jeffrey has pointed out, most of the stuff from emanating from Venezuela goes to Africa and Europe anyway. Doesn't even come to the United States.
And not fentanyl either.
Further reason why, listen, it goes back. Just because something's imperfect doesn't mean you go to use force against it. There's some things, given the crooked nature of mankind, you just got to live with and try to minimize its harms. But I can guarantee you, going to war, and what are we going to do in Venezuela after day one? It's going to be like another Afghanistan, briar patch. All the years we wasted money on the Sandinista Contras in Nicaragua. We don't know how to change people. The best way to influence in Venezuela and elsewhere is by example, and let people themselves, by the example, be inspired and do what they feel they need to do to create a better country. It reminds me of a statement by a Virginia congressman when Greece came to the United States in 1821. They're fighting the War of Independence against the Ottoman Empire. They're asking for aid. The congressman said, "Well, you need to just follow our example here. We were fighting against the British Empire. The Ottoman Empire is crumbling. You go to win yourself. Otherwise, it's going to be a very, very fragile independence that you're going to win." And that's what our foreign policy ought to be. And that is what our foreign policy was for 100 years, until this stupid Spanish and American War and these other crazy things tempted us in being an empire and throughout republic.
Well, one thing I'll just add on top of it all and then throw to Jeffrey is that the other point I would make is what you touched on is the international waters element of it. And again, I'm glad you point out the liberty part as well. I agree with you. Regardless of our personal stance on drugs, it comes down to liberty, and personal choice. But what's interesting is that the international waters part, I'm curious what you think. In what world does this not violate the law, even if they were actually doing exactly what the U.S. government said? Because they don't have any standing in international waters to conduct policy like that or to execute people without charge. That's the thing I think stands above all the rest of it. But all that together, I think it's pretty obvious.
As a matter of law, it is, in my judgment, this is assassination. It's murder.
Yeah, I agree.
This is not self-defense. They're not acting against anybody. And the fact is, because it's international water, that doesn't make it a liberty-free zone where you can do anything you want. You could kill them. Could they rape them? Could they torture them? Oh, you're the international waters. Torture is permitted. Commit genocide in international waters. So all of that is nonsense. And that is why the so-called 40-page memorandum that apparently the Office of Legal Counsel and Department of Justice prepared, why is it classified? How? I mean, I worked in the Office of Legal Counsel. A legal opinion? These are legal arguments referred to international law. How does that become classified? That becomes a danger to national security? To know what your legal theory is?
What do you think that implies?
Yeah.
Well, no, Bruce, what do you think that implies if they have it? Seifert,
It
what do you think they're
implies
hiding?
that the reasoning is so shoddy and bad that
Correct.
it would be exposed to ridicule if they publicize it. That is exactly what it shows.
Yeah,
I don't
I'm sure.
recall.
I'm sure. I can tell you what's probably in it. Okay, I'm just speculating, but what's in it is the ramblings of Trump put in some sort of pretense of legalese.
Yeah.
So I think all these people have said, okay, Trump probably rants and raves about this topic all the time, and then the people who are listening to it said, okay, I've listened to all of Trump's words. How do I put it into some sort of legalese? But of course, I don't want anyone to see it because if anyone saw it and saw that I was trying to actually consider this a real legal opinion, nobody would ever take me seriously again the rest of my life. So of course they have to classify it. But my speculation is it's just a regurgitation of the things Trump says dressed up. Okay, so they probably read through all his truths on Truth Social and listened to him when he rants and raves in the Oval Office, and then summarize this, and and comes up with dress up the language, and that's probably what it is. But I agree with Bruce. It's classified because probably the reasoning is so poor, okay, and it's so evidently poor that it's classified, because it's so stupid. So and that's probably the reason why it's classified. I think going back to some of these, other points when Bruce raised the issue of fentanyl. I mean, do we believe if there's a huge profit in this business, okay? And a capitalist looks to make money. Many of the cartels who do this stuff say, we're just capitalists. There's a demand for this. As long as there's demand, we understand what the risk of selling it is. And we think that the reward we get as a profit is worth the risk we take of being in this business. So, but it's because people want it, okay? And people are willing to pay a high price for it, and people willing to prioritize the purchase of this. And if people didn't, then they would sell something else.
Yeah.
But people, so if we stop Mexico and we stop and China, which we're not really going to stop, okay, we think the people who have all this knowledge, okay, are not going to figure out how to arbitrage that, relocating this knowledge somewhere else, and coming up with where they're arbitraging it. Or as long as people continue to demand this stuff, you don't think there's talent in the United States of people coming up with an alternative to what fentanyl is to feed? Because what do we think? As soon as the supply disappears, which will never completely disappear, that all of a sudden the demand will disappear and people won't look for alternatives. Of course, people with addiction, they're going to look for alternatives.
A resurgence in the opioid crisis, for example.
So they're going to continue to look for alternatives. So as long as they'll find alternatives, the market will supply an alternative.
Yeah.
We don't know what that, but that's what market innovation is.
Yeah.
So
and Jeffrey, everything that you said has been verified for all of the 50 years since the war on drugs. It's not like it's just theory. We know everything you said is true because that's exactly what's happened. So the drug trade moves from Mexico, offshore, onshore, Pacific, Mediterranean, Caribbean, sometimes through Africa. We know that's how it works. And moreover, the phenomenon is not limited to the fentanyl or cocaine or anything else. We see the same phenomenon when you try to impose economic embargoes. And so all that happens is, Russia can't sell any oil, but it seeps out anyway. And you just end up rewarding middlemen because when the demand is there, the supply is going to be there. It's across the board. That's why all of these economic sanctions all fail, because they end up just all it means is the money and the supply chains just maneuver around. We've had economic sanctions against Cuba, for like 70 some years. It's still communist. It hasn't rattled the administration. Nothing's happened. And when you actually look at how these sanctions work and have a real evaluation, the result is every time you say, you know what, nothing's changed. All we do is reward different people, make the profit, but the transactions continue because it's an iron law of supply and demand. That's what Adam Smith understood in Wealth of Nations.
I think this is by design.
Years ago.
I think that there's, whether it started out that way or not, and whether even the war on drugs started out with good intentions, it instantaneously, as you often point out, Bruce, with ulterior motives, became the status quo, where then people profit from that middle ground. And I argue that's our government at this point, whether you can see CIA and other aspects of like the drug trade themselves, whether for operations or not, that's going back to like the invasion of Afghanistan. Maybe they decided to do certain things for good reasons. I doubt it, but then flooded our country with opioids, heroin, the same thing. And as Jeffrey points out, the moment that they lose that, there are other routes that the governments can profit from. I argue the opioid crisis, which never really went away, despite the state of emergency, will just go through the roof the moment that source goes away.
Yeah. And I want to underscore, it's not that we applaud this stuff. It's just using our brains to say, hey, when the cure is worse than the disease, we just got to deal with the disease and try to minimize its harms. But this idea that we can turn mankind into some, perfect, everyone can be saintly if we pass laws to that effect, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. Prohibition didn't save anybody from alcoholism, right? Nothing. It wasn't because the people behind prohibition had bad or malign motives. I mean, many of them were women who were being beaten by husbands who were alcoholic. But the cure ended up being way worse than the disease. Okay, we live along. It's not perfect. So there's still have alcoholics out there, but we use our brain powers. But it doesn't have, the Al Capone element to it that was around, when we had the Prohibition Amendment.
I think that started, there's a lot of good research and books written on the topic of how, mafia was there, but because of prohibition and then actually removing of it, and the mafia exploded and very much, even much as it's reported otherwise, essentially kind of crossed paths and immersed itself with the very governments we discussed today. Whitney Webb, for example, has some amazing books on that very overlap that relates to Epstein and Mossad and other things as well. But it's easy to see how that, even if you don't, people don't agree, let's say, with that latter part. The point is that during Prohibition, as we all know, it exploded, that was, and then the government also became involved with that, and it got really shadowy around that time. And I think that's what ultimately happens is these situations then blossom into this black market that the very people trying to stop it start profiting from, and it just becomes impossible to remove. But to your point, Bruce, if we're educated on this, we could remove them. We could change these things, but it gets set in stone,
Well, there are a couple of things. There are a couple of things. One is the fact is that, if there's the demand for something and it's profitable and a lot of people want it, people will figure out a way to supply it.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is why some of these incentives exist. A lot of these incentives exist because government creates barriers to entry, and government raises the cost to many people, like especially in the medical area. That basically the costs of medical care have risen because of government's participation, active intrusive participation, in the healthcare system. If the government stayed out of the healthcare business, okay, we likely, and if we abolished we lived there was not the FDA didn't exist the entire 250 years since the signing of the Constitution. We haven't had an FDA this whole period of time. Typically how this has been addressed with most of the history is product liability laws. Companies didn't want to go out of business, and the owners of the business didn't want to be put in jail, for producing toxins that killed people, because ultimately that's previously what had happened. If you were a company, you produced a toxin, the product liability laws would basically say, you probably knew this was the case. There's probably evidence you did it. You ignored it. You're bankrupt and you're in jail. And yes, that was for most people, a sufficient, deterrent, to not do this. Whether periods of time with some level of abuse, yes, did the abuse kill huge elements of society? We've probably killed more people by people not having access to medical care that's affordable for them than what we've done to raise the cost of medical care, supposedly to prevent deaths. We've probably killed more people by depriving people of access, by giving everyone access, and then maybe a few people in the business are charlatans, and they'll kill some people along the way. So, but we don't look at it that way. We don't think about the opportunity cost.
Yeah, but what goes to your point, Jeffrey, is that there's an incentive to have a safe product, because branding and reputation is everything. if you want to make money, you don't want to have a reputation of the user, the consumer getting killed or impaired.
Exactly.
So there's a natural incentive. It's not because the sellers are benevolent. It's because they want to make money. And this is where Adam Smith says that this is what he calls the invisible hand. There is a happy convergence between the public interest and private greed. So let's take advantage of it. We don't necessarily have to applaud greed for its own sake, but when the greed produces a public benefit, hey, that's wonderful. And when you say you have an incentive to keep your product safe, so people will buy it and use it, and you don't get a reputation of harming other people, you have a built-in encouragement or incentive to build a safe product.
Yeah.
And when you have the FDA, by the way, it wasn't created, Jeffrey, till the 1900s. So we had more than a century, and we seem to do all right without Food and Drug Administration. When you have the incentives already built, the marketplace builds in the incentives, not only to be safe, but to even find even safer ways to accomplish things, because then you can beat, the current competition. How is government going to improve on that? Because we know once you lodge the decision making with the government, the decision makers, they don't have a private financial incentive to make things better, right? They don't, because they get paid the same no matter what happens. So why are they there? They're there with ulterior motives to favor something over something else, to think that they can make the world perfect and promise that, no, you'll never have any headache again, because the government will make sure that you only have access to safe and effective drugs. So they work with a totally different incentive scheme than the private marketplace does. And it's inferior to the private marketplace, which means ultimately it stifles innovation and health prevention and makes the system worse. Now, the reason why they escape that kind of rebuke is because most of these adverse effects are unseen effects. They're the things that don't happen because government's already there. And so it's hard to put out, a picture that demonstrates, somebody dying. But that's why, in general, the health care system, when the government becomes involved, makes us less healthy as a nation and opposed to more healthy. One thing I'd observe is that if you look at even the longevity, at the founding, Jefferson, Madison, they lived to 80, 85, 90 years old, Madison. The reason why longevity was overall was relatively low is because of childhood diseases. We didn't have the protection at that time. But if you survived childhood, the likelihood that you would live to 80 or 90 was as great then, 200 years earlier, maybe even more than today. It's just, but children then were vulnerable. We've been able to attack that issue, which suggests this, we don't need all this fangled things, and such a huge portion of our medical, of our healthcare is to extend life by 30 minutes,
And at the same time, it's I guarantee it's number one going after COVID. But before that, it was one of the top 3 killers, medical treatment in the country. But it's interesting when you think about all that. What we're highlighting is, there will always be charlatans or criminals in any field. They will be there. People will try to abuse it. What I find interesting in what you guys were highlighting is that all that really happens when you go to the kind of conclusion of is that the government fills that role. They become the criminals, and they're going to be there too. I've always said this in my show, is that the government doesn't really ever remove danger from your life. They just kind of add danger and more danger to your life. I mean, there's other aspects of authority that can do that, but at the end of the day, there's never a removal of danger or theft or problems. They're always there.
What the government does, it makes us dumber about the danger in our lives, because the assumption is that the government is removing the danger from our lives.
Yeah.
So the assumption is that we don't have to be risk managers for our own life, and we're deferring risk management over the government, who does a bad job at it. Ultimately, they're making things worse, not making things better, and they're making, when they're getting the outcome they want, they're making us more dependent upon them and less dependent upon ourselves. And if you want, and if you're creating a culture of dependency, that's obviously contrary to liberty and freedom. Okay, and the pursuit of happiness. Pursuit of happiness means it's our obligation. Okay, there's no guarantee. The government has no role in it. The government says, I stay out of your life What you do with it is your business. Okay. Don't look to me for taking money from other people and putting it into your pocket. Don't look for me to do these things for you. What I'm doing is I'm keeping everyone reasonably safe by some rule of law. And then everything else you accomplish on your life, you're responsible for. That's what liberty means. Okay.
Yep.
So
Yeah.
it doesn't mean my success depends upon me coercing other people against their will. Okay, that's not it. And there's one law I can tell you every day. Every person in Congress, every person in Washington D.C., everyone in government regulatory agency, everyone who works in the White House, there's one law they break every day. It's called the law of unintended consequences. Okay, so they never give consideration to the unintended consequences of their actions. And in almost all the cases, their unintended consequences are significantly worse, than the problem that they're trying to solve, that they're unsuccessful, at solving. Going back to like reference to the COVID, did COVID pass because we got injections, or did COVID pass because, like every other virus or something that happens, is each next mutation gets gets weaker and weaker, and our body builds up through natural immunity, and that's the history of basically human beings, is that our body adapts. Okay, our body adapts. We don't need a lot of these medications, and then since then we do know that there's been a big increase in unexplained deaths, that can't be directly linked to any specific vaccine, but it is a statistical anomaly that has gone without a reasonable explanation. So even if in a court of law you might not link these these unexplained deaths back to the vaccine, it's a natural deduction to make, given the empirical evidence out there. And we also know the empirical evidence has been that almost everything the government didn't need to be done. So if we think about the cost to society of the increased amount of debt, shutting down the economy, the really perverse diversion of resources, and other things that might never be caught up. I mean, the loss of human capital. We've seen what's happened to test scores of kids who went back to school after being out a year from school. We've seen the test scores go down. That's human capital. That's the value of human capital that might never be recaptured. So when the government sat back and tried to do risk management over this, okay, there was no rational risk management process. I was asked on an interview, actually not related to COVID, at the time in mid 2020, about COVID in an interview that was done with me about Bitcoin. Just somebody was curious about my opinion on it, and my opinion was really simple. All basically you do is you give people the best available information on a real-time basis, and defer to their judgment. And people who have bad judgment, many of them, instead of relying upon their bad judgment, they'll contact some friend or somebody they know who they think's had better judgment, and they'll ask them their opinions. So the opinion, and we've shown, there's a lot of evidence out there of the wisdom of crowds. If people crowdsource stuff, and which a lot of people do, is how they make decisions. Some do it heuristics through some crowdsourcing, but ultimately that process will lead to a better outcome, than a mandated opinion, where when you're wrong on behalf of everyone. Okay, and you're not only wrong on behalf of yourself, you're wrong on behalf of 330 million plus people you're wrong for. Who wants that responsibility? Who has that knowledge that says, I have the unique cure to this, and this unique cure should be a mandate across 330 people? If I'm wrong, what's the cost associated with that? And really, should I have the confidence that I have that type of knowledge, that in such an absolute basis? Okay, all this without actually doing tests. I mean, so so it's just silly. But of course, if you induce enough fear, which again we've talked about, that's what government does better than anything else, is make you scared. Okay, so you get scared, and you surrender your liberties. Even though Ben Franklin said, you want to keep a republic, you're never going to keep a republic if you act from fear. You always need to act from reason. Okay, logic, reason, knowledge, never from fear. Okay, So that's
But
the
there's another aspect that I think is oftentimes forgotten, Jeffrey and Ryan. That is the only way in which I believe that an individual really ends up with pride and dignity is when they make their own effort. They build their own mousetrap. Sometimes you got to give them second, maybe third chances. But when the government steps in and tries to say, we feel that you are too weak and anemic, that we need to protect you and enable you to thrive because of government, and then it basically treats you as a dwarf. And I think the analogy to parents raising children is edifying here. And that is, even parents got to let their children make mistakes and learn, and they have to be able to do it because of their own independent skills and understanding, and wisdom, courage. A parent that gives their kid everything, protects them from all outside dangers, is going to end up with a very stunted child. And it's going to be harmful to the child. Even then, the parent says, well, you see, I gave you X and Y and Z. You should be so grateful. No, that's not how the human being needs to have pride, because they've done things because of themselves. I say some people need second, third chances. They stumble. But that's what's critical. You're going to have deformed people, if they believe that that they're so weak that they have to be protected from everything, and especially government, because we don't have the ability to march to our own drummer. That's wrong. That's certainly not how the United States won its independence.
And as Jeffrey's highlighting, the mandated choices of, like, they're turning people into that, the person that it's like learned helplessness, that we don't know how to make the safest choice for the collective, and so it goes back to this same, like with the fire in a theater point or anything. Like, there's, in some ways, there's logic to these arguments of a kind of a collectivist view that we have to do this for the safety of everybody. I think today we always have to air back, like, almost to our detriment to the principle of it all, right? Like, maybe there's an argument out there that the government should be able to mandate a certain choice for certain people's safety. There's probably 50 of those arguments that we might even debate over, but I think it has to come back to that hard principle where there should never be a situation where a government mandates any kind of choice for anything in your life. And I think what's weird is that sentiment would probably push back on by half the country right now. I just find that crazy, because I think that's core principles, or, the benchmarks we're talking about.
That's right. And I don't think that means that we live in a vacuum. I think the way in which healthy societies put pressure on, it's about ostracism, peer pressure, cultural norms, unwritten rules of the game, but it's not government. It's created there by the culture that says, well, you just don't do that. I mean, I think even in terms of professional circles, me dealing with lawyers and I'm sure other professions are the same. There's certain unwritten rules among lawyers. You just don't do that. It's not a crime to do X, Y, Z. There's certain principles of candor and honor and decency and truth. You just accept that's part of being a lawyer. And those are enforced and not so much through bar discipline, but just, hey, I don't want to deal with you as a co-lawyer if you're not going to deal fairly and with candor and openness. And those kinds of unwritten rules and cultural norms are far more important in having a healthy society than all the laws in the world that you could enact and then are enforced by people with ulterior motives.
I'll tell you a story related to that, Bruce.
Yeah.
I adopted a class when Ed Koch was mayor in New York. So I adopted this class. They began a program called Adopt a Class, and I was one of the very first people to adopt a class. So I go meet the teacher, and I say, I've never taught, and these were people about 14 years old. I think the 7th grade or something like the 8th graders. And so I adopted this class, and the teacher said, to build a relationship with them, a rapport, do something that's educational and fun. So I said, okay, I said, let's choose a time when, you have your class and then a lunch period, because I'd like to have the students for a couple hours. So she was able to accommodate the schedule. And so I did class. And so what I did is I brought a whole bunch of Monopoly games. Now, why did I choose the game Monopoly? I wanted basically to sit back and show people, I do real estate development. I have to deal with this government that's constantly changing the rules on me and how evil government is. So I wanted to teach them the evils of government intervention, without saying that was my objective. I was the government. So depending upon how the game evolved, I changed the rules, and then they would be yelling unfair, unfair, unfair. And then I'd say, well, this is the life I live. And then they'd say, oh, your government really behaves that way. Yeah. Oh, government is evil. I never had to tell them. They figured it out on their own. So, but one of the things is then, I know some people were upset that some of the people were cheating, during the game, the kids. So it was a different, the classroom had to have like 25, 30 kids. So I broke each up to groups of like 4 or 6 people. So there were multiple groups playing, in their group. So I said, okay, now we're going to play a second round. Okay. So we began to play the second round. So I said, now people can choose. I chose the groups the first time. You chose the groups the second time. So people chose the groups, and there were a bunch of people, 6, 7, 8 people who nobody wanted to play with. So then I asked the group, why don't you want to play with this person? They're a cheater. Okay. So then I asked the cheaters, okay, you all cheated. Okay. Which one of you won your game? Okay. None of the cheaters actually won. Okay. So I said, how do you feel? Was cheating a success? I'm not going to go into the morality of it. Okay. So I'm not going to give you a lecture on morality. Okay. If you had to think about it, is right now you're a pariah with your classmates. Okay. Nobody wants to play with you anymore. Okay. And you didn't win. So what do you think about the utility of being a cheater? Okay. And then the kid said, no, I won't ever cheat again. I said, well, try and convince your students now that you'll never cheat again and see if they'll believe you. So
Right.
I said, this is in real life with me. If I think people are cheaters in real life, yeah, they become a pariah, and this is the consequence. So all the other kids, they want to have fun playing with someone who doesn't cheat. They know you cheat. So right now, they don't want anything to do with you anymore. So explain to me how this was a successful strategy for you. So I never got into the morality of it. I just got into it. Did it have utility for them? And they said that they were sitting back and said, no. A few of them were crying. I mean, I don't want to have this reputation. I said, well, you should have thought about what you did. So now you have to think about what you need to do to remedy something, because unfortunately in life, reputation is hard to build. But then if you blow it, it's very difficult to recover. It's almost impossible, to recover. So so going back to this thing about, yes, public norms work. People behave certain way because they know if they don't behave that way, they'll become an outcast. And the worst thing for most people is to be an outcast from the community that's important for them to be a member of.
Interesting overlap to that with the world today is what's going on with Trump's administration, and almost the reverse effect. The normalization of dishonesty, of criminal action, of might makes right. It's interesting overlap.
Yeah. Well, that's true. But, I think that one thing that speaks volumes, and it's an encouraging sign. The Department of Justice, I believe, had 10,000 attorneys at the time Trump was inaugurated in 2025 in January. 5,000 of them have gone.
Wow.
They're leaving in droves, and I believe in part we're seeing that the norms that we've just discussed are being violated, and they don't want to be involved in that. They know they go to private practice, and it's almost going to be be like Cain after killing Abel, to try to get into a reputable law firm anymore because of the reputational damage from being uncandid, flouting the law, just following orders and not having any respect at all for the norms of justice that are essential if we're going to have the rule of law. But that's truly staggering. I know in the cases I've had, they've rotated attorneys in and out. It's obvious that there's huge churn factor right now going on at the department. And at least I think that's a healthy sign, to be candid. It shows that the norms, that there are still norms that exist.
Don't you think, Bruce, though, the judges should do more? I mean, like in this recent case now with like the Comey and the issue over, one is there seems to be a lot of issues there. There's a debate over whether, there's a missing audio transcript. The explanation have been given is because there was nothing talked about that during that hour and a half, 2 hour period of time, but we don't really know whether that's a truthful statement or not, and we would have no reason to believe it might be a truthful statement. unfortunately, it's a statement made by people who've already shown that they'll lie out of their own self-interest.
Right.
So therefore, you cannot take for granted it is a truthful statement, even though it potentially could be a truthful statement, because they would need to have evidence, and they don't have any evidence that it's a truthful statement, and they shouldn't be taken, at their word. Because what did Pam Bondi say? Pam Bondi first said, I reviewed everything this Halligan did, and she hadn't even seen it yet. She said she reviewed it, and then subsequent to that, she reviewed it and then signed something. She said she had reviewed it, and then like backdated it or something like that.
I just read that. That's crazy.
Why does a judge let them get away with any of that? Well,
Right.
I assume she could get disbarred. I mean, why isn't she getting disbarred? Okay, and then we have to sit back and say, does Trump want to have a attorney general that's been disbarred? Why isn't she disbarred? Why aren't there hearings? Why isn't she impeached? That should be a clear impeachable offense. And what remedy does the judge have to sanction an attorney to do that? I mean, so far we know Bovino has not been sanctioned for his lie that he admitted to a lie, and Bondi has been caught on this lie. Why are they not being sanctioned?
Well, there may be. Rudy Giuliani was ultimately disbarred, and then he's suspended in New York, disbarred in the District of Columbia. But the judicial bars are very, very weak in enforcing the norms. But you're right. The courts themselves could impose sanctions, fines, detention, civil contempt for things that are blatantly illegal. You may remember that when Bill Clinton, under oath, and there was a federal judge there in his deposition denied, having sex with that woman, he got fined $90,000 for lying to the judge.
Right.
About having sex with Monica Lewinsky. That's the president of the United States.
He lost his law license too, right?
Ultimately, he agreed to lose his law license. So those sanctions are available. It's just that the norms have been so decayed since in the last 20, 25 years that the culture simply doesn't have the same condemnation.
I think it's fear.
About lying, stealing, and whatever. But it surely, and I know, you remember the 18.5-minute gap in Watergate? This is the 18.5-minute gap. Everybody knows, really? Remember the Rosemary stretch, and the testimony was 5 days of testimony in the district court right down where my offices are. That's what needs to happen here. It's the same stupidity that you receive, they send out letters, form letters, to thousands of government employees. All of them say the same. We've looked at your individual performance and find that you're deficient. We're firing you, although the last performance rating was superior. You're telling me that these form letters were reviewed by the top person, thousands of them, with the names on somebody. Those are not individualized determinations whatsoever. It's obviously they got a directive, and it was a blunderbuss approach here. And as to the argument of selective prosecution, this is so obvious, that it's like during Jim Crow, when the only law is enforced against blacks and no whites. You really have to have a Harvard Law School education to know what's going on here. It's obvious that these people are picked out and chosen to be prosecuted because of their political ideology, for freedom of speech and freedom of association. That's a per se violation of the First Amendment. And I would dismiss these cases out of hand. You've given no reason why you've selected them other than we know what Donald Trump has said. And Donald Trump, again, he's making headaches for the lawyers because he's open and notorious about this. Right. This is the press of the United States making it clear what the motivation is.
Yeah, he just gave instructions. They opened up investigations now against, Clinton and a few other people. It's not like Trump said, I'm appalled at what the Epstein file is, and everybody mentioned they should open an investigation against. No, he's just selecting a few. How is not that prima facie evidence that this is a persecution and malicious prosecution? How is this? What more do we need than his statements? It's not like a universal application. He's not looking for everyone mentioned in in the Epstein files. He's just picked out a couple of people who he hates, and that's the ones that they should investigate. And Pembondi says, yes, sir, and they're out at work doing that. How is that not impeachable, and how is every court not just slapping that down immediately? You
Yeah.
know, I mean, what more evidence do they need that this is malicious? Why do they need to get into the real meticulous texts of the law as if this is not when something's as obvious as this? It shouldn't need this minutia of 120-page, legal opinion. You
No.
just say, look, this is clearly malicious prosecution. You have the president saying these are enemies, go after them. There's no criteria other than that, and you're just being obedient to his instructions. This is now how we think. This is not what our legal system is based upon.
Yeah.
Equal justice under the law. This is in violation of equal justice under the law. Come back to us when you demonstrate you actually understand what those words mean. This is what the court should be doing. And I agree with what's Ryan's statement. Again, it's just speculation, but I agree with it. I think it's fear. Okay. That's what you said. Ryan, is you believe it's out of fear. I think, there's several evidences of the fact that, it's out of fear. I mean, one is you pretty much have MTG now, while she's somewhat of a performance artist, in my opinion. I think she is worried for her life every time Trump calls her a traitor. So, it was fun when Trump was calling somebody else a traitor, and they would be doxxed and swatted and things like that, but now that it happens to them, now all of a sudden they're worried. So I think she's probably legitimately worried that every day Trump calls her traitor, and Trump plays on that. Trump says, gee, I know there are people out there that will respond, and it's funny. We all had this language. Let's tone down because it's calling people certain names is why Charlie Kirk got shot.
Right.
Okay?
30 seconds ago.
That's what calling these people names incited people to violence. Okay. So now we have the same people who were saying to the you called fascist and stuff like that. I would think if you're going to choose which word is worse to be called, a fascist or a traitor, traitor might be the worst word. I mean, fascist is you have an ideology that most people reject. A traitor means you're actually trying to be a traitor against the country itself.
Yeah. There's a legal standing there. Yeah.
Okay. You're Benedict Arnold. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I would just say this:
a traitor is an act of treason. Okay.
Exactly.
Being a fascist is not an act of treason. Being a traitor is an act of treason. Okay. But he's calling her to have someone who is committing treason. Okay. So people will get upset when somebody thinks somebody's behaving in a treasonous fashion, and that probably would create more outrage than just somebody calling people a racist or a fascist. Okay. So he's using probably more inflammatory language. And where's the criticism? Where is the criticism?
Aside from the fact that treason is the only crime that's actually defined in its elements in the United States Constitution, and it says levying war against the United States. Now, you may dislike what Marjorie Taylor Greene says, but to suggest that that's treason in any constitutional sense is absurd. But to go beyond that, I believe, Jeffrey, that if you had one court stood up and said, we're just dismissing the prosecution out of hand, they just read what Trump stated. Okay. Once that happens, they'll stop because the lawyers then can't keep coming in over and over again. Because I don't believe that Trump is able to stop himself with regard to this kind of ranting like a 5-year-old, and that he'll continue to make the statements. But the lawyers have to have the backbone to say, we're simply not going to go forward and do that. It was the same kind of department I was proud to be part of during Watergate that said to Mr. Nixon, no, we're not doing that. We're going to quit. We're going to resign. We're going to help you get impeached. You can have your own legal team over at the White House, but it's not going to be the Department of Justice. So I think that's the way in which this would not snowball. It would probably come, in my judgment, to a halt. Now, with regard to, the fear factor, well, I understand that. But what was the fear factor of the signatories that go back to the Declaration of Independence? If you aren't willing and don't have a culture that has some people who are willing to accept some danger, we're done. We're done. It emboldens the bullies to be even worse when they feel that by pushing, it'll get people to back away. I know it takes an element of courage, but that's what the result is. And it's not rocket science that this emboldens bullies.
Right.
When they feel that they're silencing you because you're making these statements, then they'll even become more aggressive.
That's exactly what I accuse the courts of doing. They're
Yeah.
enabling the bullying.
And that's why I
They're
think
coming up with narrow textual statements.
Yeah.
Okay. Narrow textual statements, but it's like seeing, it's like paying attention to the trees and ignoring the forest.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And,
right,
and, and
right.
moreover, there's a very
And
famous
I
case.
think that's a serious mistake, because I
It is.
agree with you. The first judge who said, I'm not even taking this seriously because it's not worth taking seriously because Trump keeps tweeting this stuff, and you keep responding to this, and it's clearly this is just persecution and retribution. So we're rejecting this. We're not going to get further. Goodbye. Yes, I agree with you. It would stop. Okay. Yeah. It either stop, or maybe Trump would order the assassination of these judges who do it.
Well, can I jump in really quickly on that, Jeffrey? See, that's really important, though.
I'm just teasing about
that.
No,
I know you were joking, but that's a really important thing. What we were getting at here is to maybe take back from assassination, that I guarantee you, even if they knew they were going to fail, that Trump would probably do his best to ruin the lives of the people that put that in place. And we've already seen this take place. So it's that kind of sentiment. And to your point, Bruce, in no way are any of us, I think, trying to argue that that's acceptable. Like it's embarrassing. It's disrespectful to the foundation of this country to shy away from that just because there's risk. I mean, that's the whole point. But the problem is that there's so many people, as we often point out on the show, that have worked their way into those positions because they are those people, because they're willing to bow to the power and do whatever they can to scrape at their feet to make some, gain power themselves. And so the point is that they've already created that situation. So we just need more people like this to stand up and take those actions. But I think that will come. I agree with you both. I think that at some point, somebody's going to put their foot down, and it's going to cause a little bit of a, something, it'll cause something coming to head. But I hope that we have
the second element I wanted to show, also with respect, I think, to fear, is this case, because it's news again, is the work that Willis was doing in Georgia. Okay, let's recount what Willis did in Georgia. Okay, Willis got out there, and I think she got Cheeseboro and the Kraken woman, Sidney Powell, and two other people. She and to basically
Jenna, the Colorado attorney pled guilty. Yeah,
Abbott, yes. So they pled guilty. Okay, and they were cooperating. Okay. So they pled guilty to the fact that there was a conspiracy, okay, and that they were doing inappropriate things with fake electors, and they were cooperating, okay. So now we're going to have when this prosecutor couldn't find somebody else to take over the case, now he's basically doing it himself, and he'll make a judgment on whether to proceed or not. Obviously, if you had four people who already pled guilty, okay, acknowledged their part and were cooperating, obviously, this is something that should be investigated more. There should be no question to it. What were one of the things that when we testified, and again, this is this is where you have to have some critical thinking skills that we keep referring to. They brought a former judge to testify in the hearings regarding Fannie Willis, okay? And this judge, she had gone to try and get him to be on the team before she went to her then boyfriend Wade. Okay, so we have a situation where she's trying to get reputable people, and what was his response when he testified on the stand? This should have been appalling to the whole society. He said, "Life's too short. Basically, I don't want to have this type of problem in my life." Okay, because he didn't want to, because he commented on the type of things that she had to go through, moving out of her home, the threats to the life, the doxing. He just said, "I'm an old guy. I've had a good career. I don't need to have this problem." What does it say about a rule of law system when we have people like this who just say, it's just too costly for me because, these are the consequences. Yes, we don't have people who are profiles of courage who say this is an important case. They sit back and say it might be an important case. I wish you luck, but I don't want this problem in my life. Okay, I want to enjoy my family. My family doesn't want to see me doing it because they don't want to have this problems in our day-to-day life. So what does Trump turn to? When things important to him, when he wanted to control the Republican Party, who'd he put in there? His daughter-in-law, right? Lara, so he put the daughter-in-law. So you use kind of nepotism because these are people you trust. So here you have a case where you have a person going after the president and his whole army of people. Everybody's scared off. So who can she trust? Not many people wanted to be there. So she went to somebody she had a relationship with, who was somebody she could trust. And it seems that they were successful. Okay. So the whole concept of pushing him out, they never really proved evidence that she was doing this to enrich him. Okay. So they said supposedly the appearance was bad, but the appearance is not bad that people pay Supreme Court justices, billions of dollars, millions of dollars to enjoy vacations. That appearance is fine. Okay. That appearance is okay. Okay. So it's certainly okay for, Clarence Thomas's wife, Jenny, to be a complete activist, doing all this stuff, and supposedly that has no impact on Clarence Thomas in the rulings he made. That's all okay. Okay. All the free vacations, paying for people's education, all the other perks that they were given, many of which they never reported. Okay. That's all okay. Okay. But what's not okay is someone having a personal relationship and doing it while they're also working effectively as a team. Okay. And when people checked, what compensation he was getting, he got less money than Trump has paid Alina Habba. Okay. So when she was very good, and he was certainly a more competent attorney than Alina is, so people shouldn't have been crying about the fees because Trump has paid millions of dollars to her. Okay. Much less than he had paid for doing a case that almost nobody else wanted to be involved in because of the problems in their life.
Yeah, but let me I think compound the issue that you've quite eloquently addressed, Jeffrey, and that is this wasn't a case where it was kind of thin and you were kind of pushing the edge. Remember the infamous telephone conversation, which is like 5 smoking guns, where Mr. Trump is expressly stating, go find those 10,000 or 11,700 votes. And if you don't, you could be in criminal justice problem.
Just one thing. I'll add one more thing, and then you'll continue. He also said, once you find them, stop looking. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
But go ahead.
Just one. And so it's hard even to imagine a better case. If we want, I believe, to look at the most similar parallel in the United States, we go back to Watergate and the White House tapes, where we have Nixon saying, yeah, we can raise the money, but it would be wrong. And he's telling Haldeman, you can just tell a grand jury you don't remember when you do remember, right? And those tapes were devastating, and they led to convictions of 7 of the Watergate cover-ups. And it's the reason why I believe Mr. Nixon would have been indicted if there weren't for the Ford pardon. So this is the equivalent of the White House tapes. We know the White House tapes were ironclad. Everybody got convicted of the conspiracy to cover up, conceal, obstruct justice. And that's what you have in Georgia in spades. No one's ever disputed the authenticity of the telephone transcript. And it's so obvious what Trump was doing here, and he's following up. Lindsey Graham made a couple of vagrant fall calls to, well, what are you doing with regard to looking at these or that votes? It's obvious as well because in Georgia, they did recount after recount after recount, and none of it changed. In fact, I think ultimately it had a few more votes for Biden. I mean, it's hard to imagine a stronger case on the merits than other ones. So it's not like, this guy could be accused of pursuing, indictments that are very thin. I just walk in with the tapes, say, okay, you got to convince a jury still. But that, I think, shows, how fearful or intimidated this lawyer was and reluctant to take the case, no matter how inviting it was. I can guarantee you at Watergate, no, there were not difficulties in getting very top flight lawyers to come and work on the case.
But this is the change in the culture from today to then. Because also thinking about you probably recall, the incidents of and how things have changed. The Keating Five, the senators, the five senators that went to meet with the head of the I don't know if it was
FSLIC, Federal Savings Loan Insurance Incorporated, FSLIC.
Yes. Yeah, they went to met with Fislick. I think it was Ed Gray might have been the head at the time, to pressure them about Keating's banks to keep that he felt he was being persecuted by the regulators. 5 people, went in the Consini and a guy from California, and McCain was one of the
John
five.
McCain. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So they got sanctioned for their participation, and they did not put the type of pressure on Gray that Trump put on, the people in Georgia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They didn't threaten them with criminal prosecution if they didn't comply, for sure. Yeah, I mean, this is anyway. That's it's again, it's doesn't need everybody, but any rule of law culture requires at least some people to risk being like Sir Thomas More, and telling Henry VIII, no, you can't divorce Catherine of Aragon. It's a risk. Thomas More paid for it. I don't think you necessarily have to take that risk here today. But if you don't have at least some level of commitment and ability to be a profile in courage, the system isn't going to hold. Because if you look at the bell-shaped curve, most people are rather timid and risk averse. They don't want to do that. But there's got to be some outside the bell-shaped curve that are willing to take the risks. And it's very, very alarming that so few in the United States remain that have that stature.
Well, I'd like to believe that at least some might be listening to this podcast, and hopefully the point could be obviously taken that should you be the one out there to take that step, that there'd be plenty of people like us that would stand up and support you, people like us that would stand up and call out what that is and how that's what we should be doing. I'd like to believe that is what is the real majority beneath all of the nonsense going on today and all the politics and social media, that the right thing would be easily seen and supported by the majority. That's what I actually
agree.
believe.
And it's got to be public acclaim too, clap or whatever, we applaud what you're doing. And that's what we have. I hope on our show, somebody does stand up. We go out of our way to compliment them, like the U.S. Attorney in the Southern District of New York, who said, no, I'm not staying around when you're telling Eric Adams he can get a pass for reasons having nothing to do with the quantity of evidence suggesting criminality. So they need to get social esteem, public esteem, that will give them encouragement. They don't feel like they're just a lone ranger out there and have taken risks and gotten nothing in return.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, we should create a list of people who have a profiles in courage, people who have, that people know the people who have, maybe people don't want to be known because they're scared of the consequences. But, so we have to have a, recognition for people who have done the courageous act. And are standing up, because we need more people to stand up. And again, this is not just standing up to Trump. It's nothing personal. It's not against Trump. It's not against his ideology, politically. It's against the actions he's taken, that are rebellious to our constitutional roots. And again, as Bruce has mentioned, we don't think only Trump has acted as a rebellious to our constitutional, foundations. So, every president has proven to be an enemy of liberty, and every president has proven to be an enemy of justice. And every president, in recent times, has basically, used military power in a way, never contemplated. And we did have a president, who was not a bad general. Okay, so who had some familiarity with the military, and this president also, you could define that. I mean, maybe not the mandate Trump has. Okay, but George Washington had some level of military skills, right? He had a title in the military. What was it? What was his rank? It was general, I think it was. Yeah. Okay. He was a general of the whole forces of the American Revolution, right?
Yes.
Okay? He also was the president at the Constitutional Convention. Okay.
Yes,
he ran twice for president, right? Okay. I think, as I recall, he won 100% of the electoral votes. Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a guy who knows something about the Constitution. Okay. Knows something about being, that would George Washington ever say, "I'm the savior of the"? If there's anyone who could say they're the savior of the country, if there's anyone who might be able to say that and get away with it, it would be George Washington, right? Do we think Trump has saved the country more than George Washington did? Okay, so did he inherit a depression? Usual circumstances. Have life really materially gotten significantly better? No, it hasn't. I mean, so would George Washington say, "I'm the president, so I have absolute power"? Would George Washington make that statement?
No, in fact, he said the opposite. Again, among one of his many comments is he said a couple of things. One, first, unlike signing statements, he said, I have to veto or sign a bill in toto. I can't divide it up and say some parts I'll sign and others I'll ignore. Second thing he said is, no, I can't go to war on my own. If we are going to use the military in any offensive capacity, Congress has to deliberate upon it and approve it before I can do anything. Those, among other things that he said. He also said in his farewell address that, listen, if there's something in the Constitution that we feel is defective, we can amend it. But we have to comply with the Constitution as it is. We were not infallible. There may be needs to change, and we have an amendment process to do that. But the rule of law is critical here. So we understood that he currently did not believe and claim that he had limitless power.
So if George Washington convened a cabinet meeting and a couple of smart people, so let's say George Washington's in the room with Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, okay? So they also know a few things, right? One had something to do with the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the other had something to do with the Declaration of Independence, okay? Yeah. So they sat in a room, okay? And George said, we got we got all these countries out there. They're still bothering us around the nation. I want to be able to. We have a lot of national emergencies. Okay, so I want to send troops into a whole bunch of states. Because we still have some people loyal to the king, the monarch. So I want to go in and I want to just send them to some African country. Okay, and by the way, I want to impose tariffs everywhere in the world. Especially highest tariffs on countries that have ever said anything bad about me. Okay, so and I want to say tariffs because we have a terrible national emergency. We got this debt. We got to figure out how to pay it off. So I just want to be able to just impose tariffs anywhere. By the way, there's some pirates and other people doing bad. And I want to do a bunch of other things. So I want to basically just recruit an army, and I don't want to take, and I just want to killing people all over the place. Okay. What do you think James Madison and Thomas Jefferson would say? Do you believe George Washington would ever say any of those things? And in case he did, what would Thomas Jefferson and James Madison say to Washington?
Well, he never would have said any of those things. And you remember that James Madison, he wrote the inaugural address of George Washington. He wrote the House response to the inaugural address and then Washington's response. So George Washington was a man of unbelievable character, but he knew he had intellectual limits. And Madison, of course, was very self-effacing and was willing to do this. Most people don't understand. Madison basically was writing to himself. But these were statements of great grace, great humility, and indeed in the farewell address itself, George Washington says, I should maybe stop here, but maybe there's something I could say that is wise and you may consider for the ages. But it's not a boast saying, well, I'm so smart, I'm issuing papal encyclicals or I'm infallible. And so here's what you need to do for the next 200 years. He acknowledged, I can make errors too. And these are things to think about. So it'd be so uncharacteristic of Washington even consider any of those things. Indeed, he was very deliberative. And in fact, what he would do is he would ask, before he came up with any even tentative opinion, he would ask for Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson, to talk. He'd talk it through, and then he'd make up his own judgment. But he was a person who knew how to listen. He knew his limits, but he was a very, very gifted writer as well, certainly at that time. And the idea that he would have ever mentioned any of this, it's so beyond the pale. He would have resigned rather than do that. It's said of Washington that, his military exploits made him a hero, but his character made him a legend. And when he turned into a legend, that discredits the idea that any of these things that you've mentioned would ever even go through his brain. It's not like Jimmy Carter. I had lust in my mind or whatever to play with. He never even had these ideas. They were alien to his whole existence, which is why he still, surpasses all others in terms of the presidencies of the United States of America. So
I want to ask you a different question, Bruce. And like I said, do you think really, if you had a private conversation with Alito, Kavanaugh, Roberts, Amy Coney Barrett, Kavanaugh, that group, okay, and you really ask them, all the stuff Trump is doing, you really think that Washington, Jefferson, and Madison would be okay with any of this? You think they would like a president to have these powers? I want to know. Tell me the truth. When you went to school and you've studied this, I assume you know a little something, and you read a few things about what they wrote. So you might have read the Declaration of Independence. Who knows? Maybe they never did. I assume you have some familiarity with the Bill of Rights. Okay, so you can parse legal opinions very well. Okay, no doubt that you can. Anyone intelligent can take language and parse it. Okay, yeah. Anyone can do that. Anyone with a reasonable level of cognitive skills, who's smarter than just being an idiot, can take language that's an imperfect form of communication and parse them. Okay, and they have great skills at parsing the words. But if you want to get to the foundational principles, okay, would any of them, you think, really believe that this is the design of James Madison and Jefferson, and that Washington, who had the greatest mandate in history, would do any of this stuff?
No, I think that they would probably not want to answer the question.
Right.
I think that would just dodge the question and say, well, we live in different times, or, the case law has evolved or something like that. Because they couldn't, they have enough intellect.
The law might have evolved, but the principle has not.
Exactly.
Does it have a statute of limitation, the Constitution, with respect to the main objective?
No.
Liberty? Okay.
No. I think if you force them, to answer, under oath, they would have to concede. No, it disrespects what we call original meaning, the understanding of the Constitution. But then they would come up with some political excuse as to, well, we live in different times today, and it's just not acceptable. We're an empire, and we can't undercut the president. The kind of crap that went into Trump versus United States.
Well, then you say to them, well, the founders understood that change. That's why they have something called an amendment.
Okay? Right, and we've done it 27 times.
You studied this process, right? You went to law school, right? You do understand there is this concept of an amendment, right?
Yeah, in fact, it was one of the first issues of the first Congress was the Bill of Rights Amendment. So you know how it works. And they understood that you need to amend rather than just believe that circumstances will transform words into homonyms rather than to synonyms.
But Bruce, as you pointed out before, though, Bruce, that the amendment process has already been bastardized because there's numerous amendments that are contradictory to the current, which is, Murray Madison, many different points we've made. It is already illegal. So they're already of the mind that certain things that are repugnant to the Constitution are actually standing. So so that already seems contradictory to me,
Well, you can't. Something that's in the Constitution can't be unconstitutional. That's the reason why it's in the Constitution, because it receives that level of legal dignity.
But my point is, if they pass a law or an amendment that is repugnant to the Constitution as it stands, that should be null and void per Mayberry versus Madison.
I don't believe so, because Ryan and Jeffrey, the Constitution identifies two subjects and two subjects alone, which are beyond amendment. Everything else is fair game. One, you can't change the equal representation of states in the Senate. That's one. The second was you couldn't prohibit importation of slaves earlier than 1808. Those are so that the framers contemplated taking certain subjects off the amendment process, and they came up with two. But it implies that those are the only two. Everything else that you want to amend is on the table. And that's why slavery was on the table. I mean, when the anti-slavery amendment was ratified in 1865, it didn't offend anything in the Constitution.
That's my point, though.
Yeah.
If it should be repugnant to something currently in the Constitution, then, as we've talked about this in the past, it's Marbury versus Madison, if I'm saying correctly, right? 1803, was that what it was? I forget.
Yeah, that simply said that the courts have the authority to determine that a statute is unconstitutional. And that's
but the quote was, if it's repugnant to the Constitution, it's null and void. And so I was of the mindset.
A law.
No, that's what I'm talking about. So if they have an amendment to the Constitution that then changes the legal standing, and if it's repugnant to the Constitution, does that then make it not legally constitutional?
No, because in terms of the hierarchy, Ryan, the Constitution is above a statute, so that the courts have the authority to determine a statute is contrary to the Constitution, but it doesn't have authority to say the Constitution is subordinate to the Constitution, that everything in the Constitution is on the same legal playing field, if you will, except for two subjects. If amendment said, the states are now going to have different representation in the Senate, clearly courts could say, no, it's clear under the Constitution, you can't amend to create differentials in the Senate among the states, or the slave trade before then. But other than that, if you get it passed into the constitutional domain, it's higher than a statute, because an amendment requires 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, 3/4 of the state legislatures. A statute just requires simple majorities in the House and the Senate, and then the presidential signature.
So if you were to pass an amendment today that said that you can no longer own a gun, and everybody voted for that, we're saying that would then be constitutional going forward.
That's right. It's the same. It would be, try to think of this parallel, I think, Ryan. We had a prohibition amendment, right? And then we repealed the prohibition amendment. So we have a Second Amendment on protection of individual rights to own guns, but you can repeal the Second Amendment.
Okay, that's what I'm getting at. That's interesting. So I was of the mind that if that happened, like that inherent God-given rights were not something that were created by man, it's God-given. And so the argument I understood this as, and you know much more than I do, that's why I'm interested by this, is that there are foundational principle, like that we have the right to free speech, that these things can't be altered away by new amendments, new legal standing. But so what you're saying is, the way that you understand it is that could happen, that all of them could vote that we no longer have the right to free speech, and therefore we no longer have the right to free speech within the Constitution. Is that what you're saying? Because that's new to me. That's alarming.
Yes. Okay, but it gets tentative here, and I don't want to be evasive. But on the one, in a technical legal sense, all the amendments, free speech, due process, you could amend it. I mean, so the Constitution could turn into a blueprint for tyranny and despotism. But I believe that, and that's why I go back and say, you have to read the Constitution with the Declaration of Independence in the background as kind of foundational principles. And so as a political matter, as opposed to a legal matter, and politics is often more important than law, as a political matter, at that point, the Declaration says you have a right to replace that form of government and impose one that's more helpful to your safety and confidence, to prevent oppression. And so it would create a political right to revolt and say, okay, I'm not complying at all. Like we declared on July 4th, we're not complying with King George III anymore. We're replacing you. And you could argue, I think, persuasively from the Declaration, okay, that's constitutional, but now we're moving to a whole new post-constitutional or new constitutional system.
Okay.
We're not, as a political matter, we have no obligation to obey such a tyrannical document.
Interesting. Well, thank you for doing that. I mean, this is exactly why Jeffrey and I would argue there shouldn't be government in the first place. But, it's an interesting point, because it does open that door to, the very foundational ideas, the principles we're discussing very well with this direction of a government could very well, it could be taken, could be altered, could be changed to suit their interest of the way this operates. And that's just alarming to me. So I'm glad that we're talking about this.
It is. And I think, in terms of modern times, where we see, whereas you get a glimpse of that obligation, if you will, it's in Nazi Germany. Okay, technically everything they did was consistent with the Weimar Constitution. They amended everything. They said Hitler, the Der Fuhrer, could do whatever they wanted. But as a political matter, these were so abhorrent, that ultimately after the war, these rules and decrees were viewed as voidable, if you will, or void from the outset. The Nuremberg laws, for example. And so that was a situation where, okay, maybe they complied with all the rules of the Constitution, but the Constitution had become, so tyrannical that you had a political right to say, no, I'm not abiding with anything. We have to have a new dispensation.
That's
Interesting.
why some people have. So it used to be many people who were kind of libertarian oriented, had proposed that maybe it's time for a convention of the states to rewrite the Constitution. So because they think the current application of the Constitution is so divorced from our foundational principles that we got to get back to our foundational principles, and the courts have done such a horrible job at basically creating a whole set of precedent that's so at conflict with our principles that to build upon that is just impossible. So we got to go back to square one. So, but I think today, if we probably went back to square one, which many people now fear, is we'd get a document that is even worse than what we live under today. We might find that people don't even like freedom of speech. We might find a document that defines hate speech, and so we might find a document that ends up, as bad as the courts are. We might come up to a document that's even more oppressive than the existing document, and the way it's been, constructed by the courts, their opinions.
Yeah,
So
it goes back, I think, Jeffrey and Ryan, to what we talked about at the outset: education. The system can't work without citizens who are educated and subscribe to these beliefs, because it's the consensus of the people, what we call the orthodoxies, that are ultimately going to prevail. And we can't survive with this level of illiteracy much longer, because we are back, in my judgment, to pre-July 4th, 1776 thinking. You got a king, whatever. You don't have to worry about process. You don't like something, you just get rid of it. You kill it. You destroy it. You arbitrarily take away. You use the law to fight enemies rather than to sustain justice. All of that, and that's why we keep coming back. We have to totally reform education. It doesn't mean just in classrooms. It means education that occurs around the dinner table, in the church or the mosque or in the synagogue. The education when you're talking to your friends. We just got to upgrade, what level of decency and understanding we have as a self-governing people in all walks of life all the time.
So playing this what if speculative game, okay,
Yeah.
but they left a huge body of literature. Okay. If you took, if somehow, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison could live for, 1 week, and the 1 week, like the person from the Clockwork Orange, what they did is they got put in front of a screen and they watched all the things Trump has said, over his presidency, and then they walked out and said, okay, what adjectives would you describe, the government today and Trump's interpretation of the role of the presidency? Okay, would they say he's perfectly fulfilled, our vision of a constitutional republic, or would they call him a despot, tyrant? What adjectives do you think they would use, in describing, his Trump's interpretation of the Constitution today, with the statements he's made that he's a savior of the country, he's got unlimited Article 2 powers, that he's killing all these people in Venezuela, off the coast, that we've been invaded by we have this invaded with the intention to overthrow the country by Tren de Aragua, all these things that and I have to impose tariffs all over the world, especially when somebody says, something I don't like, and then I got to give them even a more punitive tariff to them. So what do you think what would be their words leaving, after having seen, all these clips of Trump from out of his own mouth?
Yeah. Well, they would say that, he has now restored the tyranny that we fought against in July 4th, 1776, and sought to prevent in the Constitution of the United States. This truly is the counter-revolution against the American Declaration.
Okay.
All of the
and again, so going back to this one step further,
yeah.
Do you think Alito, Kavanaugh, whatever, if they were asked that question, that they also know that would be the answer to watching those things?
No, they would come up with some.
But honestly, do you think what are their honest opinions of?
No, I think they would say that's true, but the other side is so bad we have to kind of take shortcuts around the Constitution to protect civilization. Again, it's a variation of we had to destroy the village to save it. You know,
No
we
principle.
have to, the ends justify the means, I believe is what their attitude would be.
They have to breach the Constitution to save the republic.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
No principles.
Right, exactly. We have to turn to lawlessness to protect the rule of law.
So,
Obviously, it's-
is that the oath of office they take?
not any oath that's written in the Constitution, that's for sure.
Yeah.
To uphold and defend and preserve the Constitution of the United States. Yeah, that's
So-
what I believe they would say.
So maybe they should be impeached also.
Yes,
Yeah.
I've written in favor of impeachment, but I say this is the paradox we confront, Ryan and Jeffrey, is that all right? Who's going to impeach them? The Congress of the United States? They're imperi delicto. I mean, if I was the justice impeach, who are you to impeach me? You violate your oath of office every 5 seconds. Why are you? You're the judge who's going to judge me. So we're in kind of that hard spot. Well, we don't even have an institution with the credibility and the standing to undertake the impeachment.
It's what's it called? It's self-assured destruction. Is that the term? What is it? Where
mutually assured destruction.
mutually assured.
Yeah.
You know, they all know that's. And I argue that in a way, if there is some kind of a gatekeeping, whatever we want to talk about, you know, some higher corporate forces that sort of dictate, you know, lobbying to one degree, that they make sure people who might have more principles. I'm amazed that a Massey makes it through, but you know, that when they get to that position, it's sort of like the manufacturing consent point for media, right? They wouldn't be there if they didn't already hold certain beliefs that they don't even know that they're being played in some way, you know, so they both know that they're criminals, so they let it go.
No, I agree. I agree that, you know, the candidates get attracted, you know, because of certain phenomena. That's why I call them all sociopaths. Otherwise, they wouldn't be running for Congress. And then the reason why the initial, I think, contingent were not sociopaths because Congress didn't have all the powers. That is, the idea was you came, you served a few terms, and then you left and went back and built universities like the University of Virginia, and wrote and spoke. But your legacy was your wisdom and your character, not, you know, all the bills you passed when you were in Congress or not. But that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, and part of it is because the government has grown so big, it's an empire, you know, and hey, why do you want to walk away? You have the ability to preside or be influencing over the largest so-called de facto corporation in the history of the world, $7 trillion annual budget. You can do favors for your friends and you feel you're intoxicated with power. Look at you're involved in such a grand enterprise. Those are the people we do not want in government. We want people in government who want to do nothing other than law enforcement, and make sure that, you know, the bare necessities are there. I believe we're wealthy enough to provide a safety net for those who fall on hardship or even those who are indolent, but let's not let anyone die in the street because of starvation. We're better than that. But other than that, the government shouldn't do anything else. And the fact is, with that kind of government, we would have a Cincinnatus, even without a standing army. If we were attacked, we would have people run to the barricades immediately, defend the country, and we would win because everybody would be willing to risk their lives. They're not mercenaries. They would do anything to protect such a grand country. And everybody would be a Cincinnatus. So we don't need a standing army. That's what all these people who so-called military experts don't understand. They don't understand human beings, that the real victory comes from people who are willing to risk their lives for their country. And not how many weapons you have here or there. Go back to Vietnam. You think that we lost in Vietnam because we didn't have superior weapons to Ho Chi Minh and wheelbarrows coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail? We had all this superiority in the history that could be imagined. And we lost. It wasn't even close.
I would speculate that the people who might fight the hardest are the immigrants who understand why they came here.
Yeah.
And if somebody wanted to invade them, they're the ones who have lived through that experience before, who came here to avoid it, and they probably won't be the ones to fight the hardest, you know, to prevent that experience.
Yeah.
So because they don't take it for granted, like we take for granted. Ryan, before we wrap up, I have a couple of questions for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like I says, Bruce, do you think that our founders, our framers, do you think that these were really, you know, people of the Enlightenment who applied reason to try and produce a document where they thought they were attempting to secure to the greatest extent possible where an objective function was people living under liberty?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think generally speaking, yes, but I think it's objective. For one point, it's objective to stand back and say, were there likely some people in that room that didn't feel as passionately as others? Yeah. And I mean, Bruce could probably even point out his opinion about where that line would be for some, but I would argue by and large, this is what I've tend to say on the show, is that, that yes, that's ultimately that won out. The sentiment, I think, largely driven by different, rationale. Some of them probably just wanted more ability to, wanted more freedom for everybody, more so for themselves, differing driving force. But at the end of the day, the mindset won out that we wanted a,
Okay.
liberty. No, hold on.
I'm going to ask a follow-up question to this too.
Okay, well, let me go ahead, let me finish my point. But so the idea that generally speaking that they achieved that, but then just to wrap it up quickly, the point would be that there were some that didn't necessarily feel the same, and that very quickly in my mind, and I think you speak to Andrew Jackson, Bruce, but at some point we rapidly lost that because those self-serving sentiments ultimately won right back out. But yes, the answer is I think at the beginning that's what it was. Yeah, Republican didn't keep it.
I only want to focus in the beginning because I'm trying to make a point. So I'm trying to ask these questions to get to a point. So that's why I don't want to address what happened later. And the Andy Jackson was not at the Constitutional Convention. He was not one of the intellects involved in framing the country. So I want to talk about that. Then when you go out, the ratification process, which still needed to be ratified by the rest. So you had people who certainly didn't want to live under the despotism of the king. We had people who lived under a regime of the Articles of Confederation that basically was kind of close to a state of anarchy, not really, but reasonably close. Who had to be convinced that maybe a little bit of more government, would produce better outcomes. But the people there, but to get the ratification, which is why people said you needed to have the Bill of Rights to get the ratification, because the people might never have ratified the Constitution if these type of rights. So these are people who didn't want to really pay taxes. They didn't want a big government, and they wanted to live under conditions of, personal liberty. They wanted to be sovereign individuals. Would you accept that as a reasonable generalization of that period of time?
Oh, yes, again, with the outlier that I do believe there were some that had a different view for where that should go, but I would agree. Yeah.
Okay. So the point I'm trying to make with this is that we had enough of a majority force that was concerned about personal liberty and wanted to design a government that would advance the cause and protect the cause of personal liberty and limit the government so it could never intrude and violate our personal liberty. Okay. And that many of these people were well-meaning, and that was their objective. Okay. Feeling that, anarchy doesn't work, but also individual liberty is ultimately the only legitimate role of government. And that's what the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers were about, is convincing the people that this government would not be too oppressive in nature. Okay. And that here, just a few things the government will do, and what's not defined there is left to the people. Okay. The states and the people. So that's what people believe that they were ratifying. Okay. So today we had a very well-intentioned group of people trying to come up with a document that would do a good job of avoiding tyrants and despots. And look at where we are today, even with people who framed the document, who are brilliant people with the best intentions. This is why I support anarchy, because however good the initial design is, this is what I'm trying to get back to the point I think you're trying to make. However good the initial design is, inevitably it's going to be perverted. We had a great initial design, not saying it was perfect, but it was a great initial design. And look at people who claim that they're faithful to the original intent and public meaning of everything. And look at the government today we have claiming that they're looking to the public meaning of the text and thinking that today it was the meaning of that text. Okay, as we're all agreeing that right now we're in a state of tyranny, we have despotism, we no longer come close to resembling, the Constitution. And the people who wrote that document, if they were listening to this dialogue today, they would be completely appalled at what they're seeing. So, however, whatever the genesis was, you know, of this, okay, it's been distorted, perverted into something that does not even closely resemble, the vision of the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, as Bruce says, signed their death warrants, and took that risk and had that courage. And it's why I, again, am stating my personal view that any government, no matter how well intentioned it is by the people who start off creating a government, will eventually will not be too long a period of time, morph into something that's tyrannical in nature, because that's human beings. I want to make sure I can always opt out. And anyone who creates laws that doesn't give me as a person to be able to opt out, as long as I don't hurt and cause damage to anyone else, to me is contrary to natural law. Okay. So my natural law to me is I have no obligation to anyone but myself. Okay. Nobody could coerce me an obligation to any third party. I might decide there are situations and circumstances that I find it beneficial for something to be part of another group. But if I do that, I'm going to negotiate contractual terms, and that will come to a mutual understanding that every party everyone who's a member of that contract has explicitly agreed to form part, of that group, where they've defined the terms and conditions, of their relationship, as Ryan and I have referred to. That's governance. Okay. But that's governance that's entered into voluntarily. Okay. But as long as I don't cause harm to anyone else, okay, why should anyone, if I have natural law, if I'm an individual, why can somebody say, I want to go kill these people elsewhere and come after me for my money to do that? Okay?
No, but Jeffrey, I think you've created a straw man.
Violation of natural law for anyone to take money away from me by force to use it by something I object to. Okay, that is wrong. Okay.
Well, wait, Jeffrey.
I think it's a violation of natural law, which is why I reject all government.
But okay? I think Jeffrey, here's the tension. I think, and maybe it's not resolvable. I mean, you and Ryan, I assume, would not object to a government whose sole task was to prosecute the crime of first-degree murder. That's all it did. So that, and I would hope that those prosecutions would deter people from invading, your right or Ryan's life to live. Right? You're not hurting anybody else, and that their lines. And I believe that that it's
fair. Let me answer that question you just say.
Yeah,
if somebody created a law, somebody says something and saying, look, we're going to create this mutual security pact. Okay. So, you might feel you're more secure where you're calling a security pact, where we're going to prevent people against murder, and we're going to organize ourselves to do that. Okay. And what will happen is, if you or any member of your family ever gets harm due to it for that, we're going to go after that person. Okay. So, or to have the system is you can opt out, and if you get murdered, we don't give a shit, okay? Because you've decided to opt out, so we're not going to protect you, and then I can, as a person, say, which do I prefer? Do I prefer to join this group, where I might feel a greater sense of protection, or I'll say, I don't want to be a member of this group because there are too many other strings attached to it, and I'll take the risk, or I'll provide, and maybe my risk will be I'll hire my own personal security force. Mm-hmm. So that's the choice I want left to me.
Right. So it's the absence of coercion in the conversation.
That's the question you just posed. That's my answer. Okay.
Okay. But my response would be that even if you chose to to opt out, so that it would increase then the risk that you would be murdered with impunity, it can create a class of people and embolden them to, they think, okay, well, I can go after Jeffrey, then and the murderers are not the most rational people. Maybe I can get away with it by going after other people as well. So I believe they're collateral consequences of somebody opting out of government punishing, whether you like it or not, murder. I mean, and I believe that's why in criminal law, even if the victim doesn't want a case prosecuted, the government can prosecute anyway. If they think it may be in a situation where the rape victim says, I don't want to prosecute anymore, the government may have an interest. Say, we want to have a culture that kind of frowns on this kind of behavior, even if you don't want the prosecution, we're going forward anyway. And
If a government basically says we're forming a community where things you might not do on your own, we'll do on your behalf, that's okay as long as people want to be a member of that community because they think it's good for them to do that. I don't think that's good for me. I'm not if because I don't want to protect, because I think my personal protection is my personal responsibility, and that's my responsibility. That doesn't mean somebody else can say, gee, because you're making that decision, I feel less safe. And because I feel less safe, I'm going to impose this on you. No,
let me jump in real quick. Let me get my back in what Jeffrey said. It's obviously, no matter where we go with it, it comes back to being coerced into it or not. And then to what Jeffrey's saying, no government or no body can tell me, no like institutional body can say that I'm responsible, whether by action or not, for somebody else's consequence. Like that's where you get into the fire in the theater thing. Like there might be logic to arguing by me not doing it, I put that person at risk, but that's my choice, right? And it's not my responsibility for that person's risk because of something, but again, it comes down to that coercive point in the very beginning of it, and this is exactly the kind of, look, let me say one thing, then you guys can keep going, is that I think this is where we can come together. Like I'm all the way over on the side of anarchism and the idea of no government, but I'm open to having a dialogue about maybe finding a middle ground further in that direction. Like we were just saying, like that's kind of what Jeffrey was saying in regard to, if we had that in the beginning, closer to an anarchistic society, like, the idea would be that we can inch further in that direction. And my mind would be getting further toward the idea of showing everybody that we don't need the government, but maybe there's a middle ground, Yeah,
I mean, and like, I'm going to leave as well, but one of the points too, I'd like to leave with you, Ryan and Jeffrey. What do you do with the kids? No law? You're just going to let the parents do whatever they want? How do you protect kids without law, without government? Are they slaves to the parents?
This is a huge conversation. This is where you get into the idea of anarchism is not nothing. It's not no laws. It's no rulers, no rules. It is the free grouping of individuals. The existence of our society would be nearly identical.
How does a child who's 1 year old make those decisions? They don't even have enough brain.
Well, we can make the same point to parents with their children today. They don't.
No, I agree with you. I agree with you exactly, Ryan. That's my point. I think you can make those points today. And of course, there are limits on what parents can do, and the limits are imposed by law, whether the parents like them or not. Anyway, it's a huge other issue.
We should have a whole show about talking about this. It's a fascinating conversation.
If we can get back to this level, then I'll be celebrating and running victory laps. If now we're at this level of coercion, everything else has been taken care of.
Yeah, let's just get a little less coercion in our lives, and we'll all be happy.
So Ryan, I was trying to illustrate that I was asking you leading questions to get to this point.
Yeah.
I think a point that you and I agree upon.
Yeah.
So that's why I wanted you to keep it focused on the founders not going into their direction, because that's the point I was trying to get to.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not the issue of where the starters and a couple of people had different objectives or whatever, is that even if you take for granted that these people were pure in their objectives, look at where we are today. Okay. That's an indication that once you start with the government, this is what you'll end up with. Okay. So
and to Bruce's point,
better just not start at all. Okay.
No, but Jeffrey, I mean, listen, we had a miracle. It lasted about 30 years before it fell apart because of education. But at least for those 30 years, people really enjoyed themselves, and we launched, an experiment that really made the country, compared to all the others, a beacon for all these immigrants who are coming to the United States. All the immigrants that came during that period, they were glad with the experiment, even if it expired after 30 years. So
let's get a 30-year experiment for our idea, and then come back and touch base.
Yeah, we should. I should be able to say the government has breached the contract. That the original contract was this document. Okay, the government is in breach of that contract, and I've opted out because the government has breached the original document. Okay, so for me, the document has been breached to such a point, that unfortunately it has no authority. And right now, what we're governed by, there has not really been a consent of the people. Okay?
No, for sure. This is not government.
The way we're governed today does not represent consent of the people. It actually represents a tyranny of it's either a tyranny of the minority or the tyranny of the majority, but it's tyranny. Okay,
Right now it's the tyranny of the plutocracy.
It's tyrannized the liberty
Yeah.
that when those people signed the Declaration of Independence, ratified the Constitution, this is a liberty that said, if I live in this territory, this is the liberty I'm guaranteed. Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't get that liberty that I was guaranteed by that document. Okay.
Yeah.
So would you agree with that statement, Ryan?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting is we basically agree on everything except where that leads, and I think that this conversation, like I said, could maybe lead to maybe Bruce seeing more of the light in regard to how we could have less. But I think you already are of that mind, just not none. I think is kind of where your mind is going. But also that maybe we could see the virtue in some of these parts being, in that direction. But I think we all agree right now that everyone can see where this can lead. The question is it possible to have a society that is without it? And like I said, I'm genuine when I say that, Bruce, as much as I'm joking. Like, I'd like to see if that's possible. I mean, we all see where this can go. There's people suffering, there's war, there's genocide. So at the end of the day, I hate to even say it, but how much worse could it be with a free grouping of individuals deciding their communities and so on, right? As Bruce or as Jeffrey said, we could hire security. I mean, again, I actually think we should have this conversation in the show because there's so many interesting points to go in.
No, I understand, but I think one of the most important points to keep in mind is that all three of us have the same objective. What we're searching for, a distribution of power, arrangement among people that optimizes liberty and justice. So the end game we all agree on. It's not domination, it's not control, it's not being an empire. It's everybody gets to march to their own drummer, free from domestic predation, foreign aggression. And the challenge now is, okay, how do we optimize that end goal? But it's important to have that end goal. And that's what I think distinguishes the founding generation from this one. They think, oh, no, the purpose of government is to show we're number one. We see better than other people. We kill them. We dominate them. We invade them and do all these other kinds of things. And that's just completely wrong-headed. It subordinates the individual to the government grandeur, building a ballroom or whatever. Why is the government building a stupid ballroom, right. Putting aside the illegal ways it's being done through semi-bribery? Well, no, to the extent there's aggrandizement of liberty and justice, it's the individuals that we celebrate because they did it on their own with ambition and character. That's it. That's what we have to agree upon and get away from this idea, government going to Mars or any place else, forget it. That's not what government's for. Individual wants to go to Mars, wonderful.
I agree with that. And so, yes, I think we all deeply value liberty, freedom, and justice. We have some disagreement on what are the institutions necessary to guarantee that we will live our lives under those circumstances, that our kids will live their lives under those circumstances, and that our grandchildren and their children will also live under those circumstances. Yeah. And I think the path that you'd like to see is education. Yeah. And that if we have a reasoned, if we had a society of Thomas Jeffersons and James Madisons, we wouldn't have to worry about this, because that society would never consent to these circumstances.
Correct.
So, in the absence of having a society that would produce that outcome, I'd rather have no government. So I think that's I think that's where Ryan. I don't want to speak on behalf of Ryan, but I think that's what Ryan and I believe in the in the absence of that. And yes, maybe if we today lived under the conditions that were described and we lived faithfully according to the documents that were prepared by Madison and Jefferson, and we lived under those circumstances, maybe Ryan and I would not be anarchists. Maybe we'd say this worked out. This did a great job of preserving liberty, and so we love it. But I think the focus, and that's again the unique thing about our podcast, is we have the same goal. Okay, yeah. We think the greatest that natural law, the positions of these inalienable rights, the inalienable rights of personal liberty and the sovereign individual. And the question is what's the legitimate role of government going back to the statement you made, Bruce, is these people thought about things in a philosophical way.
Yeah.
So, this is why we try and have this, philosophical conversations, and we're not afraid to challenge these, to have these philosophical challenges like you raised, with respect to, one of the things we didn't get into with, parenthood and the rights of kids, but personal security. So I think these are really important issues for us in the year celebrating the 250. We're about to enter in celebrating the 250 anniversary of the ratification of the Declaration of Independence. That this is a year for us to reflect upon. What this all meant. What did people think when they had the conversation about what kind of government it should be? What should be the objective of that government? Okay, and what are our natural rights? And to make sure our natural rights are inalienable. That means that they're not subject to question. They can't be renounced except under very rare circumstances. The fact is, we should have a conversation about how well we've done benchmarking ourselves against that standard.
Yeah.
So I think this is an opportunity for a year where it should be constant education, and that if we're really going to celebrate it, if we're really going to do it with honor, the best way of doing honor is living up to its principles.
Exactly.
That's how you honor something. If you think something's important, think it's worth honoring, you live up to those what? You don't just say, gee, I'm waving a flag, and that's it. I'm having a barbecue. I'm doing fireworks. I'm having a military parade. Okay. So,
and I think Jeffrey and Ryan, that just as if you subscribe to a religion, maybe the 10 Commandments, you honor them. You honor the religious precepts by practicing them. Okay.
Correct.
And my view is everybody can have the religion they want or the not religion. In a citizen in the United States of America has a similar obligation, if you're going to be an American, I believe, to honor the principles in the Constitution and the Declaration.
Right.
Just like you honor the religion in the same way. This is how you honor your status as an American citizen, by complying with the standards and the precepts, not flouting them or just using them as an excuse, on one day of the year, to explode fireworks probably bought from China. That so trivializes all the sacrifices, Valley Forge, all the wisdom, the deaths that gave birth to the nation. I mean, it's repugnant to my mind, to be candid. This is how you celebrate people who risk their lives for these rights, is by putting fireworks out there and not having a clue as to what they fought for.
I agree. Ryan, last word for you?
I just want people to consider the conversation we had there at the end. At least have a thought experiment, right? Walk through it. Think about what a world could be like if, with the same principles guiding people, without the overarching government hand deciding what we can and can't do, the same policemen exist, the same firemen exist, the same people that build the roads exist. You just don't have the government structure guiding us. At least consider the possibility of that. Thanks for the show, guys. I enjoyed the conversation.
Bruce, your last word.
I always compliment you. Come, we watch. We always applaud questions. If their answers are bad, it's our fault giving bad answers. But your questions are always wonderful, and we hope that you can continue to follow us and invite others here. This is about thinking, critical thinking, questioning everything, including us. And we believe, and even it's a small way, it's a way to get the pendulum back swinging towards 1776.
Amen. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Okay. Thanks.